Hello there, traveler. Worn down after a long day, playing a role in a world filled with expectations. Have you ever felt exhausted to the very core, not because the work was too heavy, but because all day long you had to force yourself to say a familiar sentence, "I'm fine." A simple phrase, polite, easy to use, but repeated until it becomes a mask pressed tightly against the skin. Behind that smile, there may be a silent storm spiraling deep within your mind. Carl Jung called that mask the persona, the social role that helps us survive, be accepted, be loved. But when the role is worn for too long, the soul begins to grow tired. It whispers, then it screams, and finally, it falls silent. The exhaustion you are carrying is not weakness. It is a sign that a deeper part of you is asking to be heard. Hello, my name is Milo. I will walk beside you on this journey of exploration into the mysterious depths of the soul. This video is not here to teach you how to live. This is a sleep story, a safe space for you to slow your nervous system, release control, and step into the night sea journey, the soul's voyage through the dark waters. Tonight, we will witness the silent dialogue between the persona and the shadow, a place where all roles are laid down so that the self may finally speak. Do not sleep to escape reality. Sleep to remember the true person who is waiting for you at the center of your soul. Yes, exactly so. The silent storm does not arrive with thunder or violent winds. It does not tear apart everything in front of you. On the contrary, it exists in an almost perfect stillness, a state in which, outwardly, you appear calm, composed, even admirable, while inwardly there is an unceasing vortex. Your mind keeps running, not because the world is too chaotic, but because the role you have worn all day has not yet loosened its grip. When night falls, the body is utterly exhausted, yet consciousness remains taut like a drawn string, because some part of you is still working, still standing guard, still performing. Carl Jung observed that human beings are not exhausted by labor alone, but by excessive identification with the persona, the social mask we wear in order to survive. The persona is not bad. It is necessary. It is how we adapt, communicate, and maintain our place within the social order. But the tragedy begins when we forget that it is only a role and start to believe that it is who we truly are. Jung warned, the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. When we live too long within that confusion. The inner world does not protest immediately. It waits. And then, in the quietest moments, when the lights are off, when there is no one left to impress, the storm begins to form. That storm has no clear shape. It appears as repetitive thoughts, old conversations, replaying again and again in the mind, nameless feelings of restlessness. You may ask yourself, why can I sleep? Nothing today was really that serious. But Jung would say that what keeps you awake does not lie in the events themselves, but in the psychic energy still trapped in the role. Libido. The current of life energy has not yet been drawn back inward. It remains directed outward, still trying to sustain images, responsibilities, expectations. And when energy is not allowed to rest, it transforms into anxiety. Within the silent storm, we begin to see a profound paradox of modern life. The more we try to appear fine, the less fine we actually are. Society rewards control, the image of being together, the well-timed smile. But the soul does not operate according to that reward system. The soul requires honesty. Jung once wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life. When we do not allow ourselves to be tired, weak, or confused, those parts do not disappear. They retreat into the shadows, accumulate energy, and give rise to a storm that moves silently through the night. What is remarkable is that this storm does not wish to destroy you. It is not an enemy. It is a signal, a reminder that you have lived too long inside a role and forgotten your own natural rhythm of breath. Jung believed that the human psyche is always inclined toward self-regulation, toward restoring balance. When the persona occupies too much space, the unconscious speaks up to draw you back. And because daytime consciousness is too loud, the unconscious chooses the night when all defenses are weakest to speak. In this context, the silent storm is not something that needs to be fixed. It is an invitation to pause, an invitation to observe, an invitation to ask, which role did I carry today that no longer fits? Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When your mind races endlessly at night, it may not be cruel fate at work, but the unconscious trying desperately to be seen. The persuasive power of the idea of the silent storm lies in how it releases you from guilt. You are not weak because you cannot sleep. You do not have a problem because your mind refuses to settle. You are simply a human being who has carried too many roles and has not yet had the chance to lay them down. And the very moment you acknowledge this is already the first step toward healing. Jung never promised a quick solution. He never said that thinking positively would be enough. He invited us instead into a more honest relationship with ourselves, one in which both light and shadow are given a place to stand. So when you lie down and feel that silent storm within you, try not to resist it. Do not rush to drive it away. Listen. Beneath those chaotic thoughts, there may be a very simple truth. You have tried too hard to become the person the world needs, and forgotten the person your soul is searching for. In that act of listening, the storm no longer needs to scream. It gradually becomes a slow, deep current carrying you into sleep, not as an escape, but as a return. And it is precisely there, in the Jungian sense, that sleep ceases to be an unconscious void and becomes a quiet space of dialogue between the parts of the soul. The silent storm in the end is not a sign that you are lost, but proof that the true self within you is still alive, still calling your name, even when the world has fallen silent, emerging from the silent storm where the mind spins, because the roles have not yet been laid down. We do not step into a new chapter through rupture, but through the revelation of the form that stands behind that storm. When thoughts still echo through the night, when the body is exhausted, but consciousness refuses to settle, we gradually realize this. What prevents us from resting is not only pressure, but the face we have worn all day long. From that very point of intersection, the theater mask appears, not loudly, not by force, but quietly, like an old prop being placed back at the center of the stage after the audience has already left. Carl Jung called this mask the persona, a concept both simple and dangerous. The persona, in essence, is not falseness. It is the bridge between the individual and society, the necessary role that allows us to exist among others. Jung wrote with great clarity, "The persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. The problem is not whether we wear a mask, but whether we forget that we are wearing one. When the mask clings so tightly that the skin beneath can no longer breathe, the soul begins to respond. The image of an ancient wooden mask appearing and then dissolving is not a random metaphor. Wooden masks were once used in ancient rituals in Greek theater, where humans stepped into the roles of gods, heroes, or monsters. When the performance ended, the mask was removed, and the actor returned to being human. Modern life, however, has reversed that order. The stage lights never go out. the audience never leaves. And the mask is never taken off. We carry it into work, into family, even into moments that should have been the most private. When night falls and all sounds quiet down, the persona still stands there alert, ready to continue performing. Jung saw a deep danger in this condition: identification with the persona. When human beings believe that they are the role itself, they lose contact with their inner life. Jung warned, one could say with some exaggeration, that the persona is that which, in reality, one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. This exaggeration was not meant to accuse, but to awaken. For when we live entirely within the image others expect, we gradually become strangers to ourselves. The theater mask, therefore, does not only conceal weakness, it also conceals the beautiful, living, primordial parts of the soul emotions that are not appropriate desires, that are not acceptable questions, that have no quick answers. The persona helps us gain acceptance, but the price is a narrowing of identity. And the profound exhaustion many people feel today does not come from doing too much, but from being far too little compared to who they truly are. What is striking in the image of the theater mask is the statement: tonight, the stage is empty and the performance has finally ended. This is not a call to rebellion or to abandon social responsibility. It is a permission to stop performing, at least for the night. Jung believed that the soul needs periods of withdrawal from the outer world in order to regenerate. He wrote, "In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the individual. When the stage is empty, when there is no one left to impress, we finally have the chance to meet ourselves again, without the mediation of roles or titles. The dissolution of the mask in the visual image is not destruction, but restoration to its proper place. The persona is not annihilated. It is hung back behind the scenes. That very moment opens space for other parts of the soul to step forward: the shadow, the disowned emotions, the fears that were never named. Jung did not see this as collapse, but as the beginning of wholeness. He affirmed, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the opposites. To integrate, one must first remove the mask. The theater mask also carries a deeply human sorrow, for many people are afraid to take it off. They fear that without the role, they will no longer be loved. But Jung would turn the question around: if love exists only while you are performing, can it truly be love for you? The persuasive power of Jungian thought lies in the fact that it does not promise immediate safety, but promises truth. And truth, though it may leave us exposed at first, is the only foundation for a meaningful life as we move from the silent storm to the theater mask. We do not abandon exhaustion. We understand it. The storm is no longer an enemy. It is a signal that the mask has reached the moment when it must be taken off. Tonight, as the stage stands empty and the lights slowly dim, no one is waiting for a perfect performance. There remains only a human being permitted to breathe, permitted to not be fine, and permitted to exist without having to prove anything. In that spirit, sleep is no longer the shutting down of consciousness, but the most sacred ritual of removing the mask. And it is precisely in the moment of playing no role at all that a person gains the chance to touch the deepest part of themselves, where healing does not come from doing better, but from being oneself. When the theater mask has been hung back behind the scenes, when the stage of life is temporarily empty and the lights no longer shine directly upon our face, another sensation begins to emerge, the dull, aching pain of the body and the soul themselves. For it is only when we stop performing that we realize how painfully we have been moving through life for so long. From that moment, we pass naturally into the next image, shoes that are too tight. This is a profound metaphor, deeply Jungian, because it does not speak of external roles, but of the fit between one as life and one as inner nature. You may have removed the mask from your face, yet your feet, which carry the full weight of the life journey, remain confined within shoes that do not belong to you. You have lived. You have walked. You have fulfilled your responsibilities. Yet with every step, some part of you has been compressed, distorted, hurt without daring to cry out. Carl Jung did not speak much about happiness in the conventional sense. He spoke more about the authenticity of one's path in life. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." This sentence seems almost born to illuminate the image of shoes that are too tight. Many people do not suffer because they have failed, but because they have succeeded in a life that is not their own. They wear shoes measured according to social norms, family expectations, collective ideals, and then blame themselves for why walking feels so unbearably difficult. Shoes that are too tight do not cause pain immediately. Like the persona, they begin with adaptation. At first, there is only slight pressure, mild discomfort. We tell ourselves, "I'll get used to it." We grow up praised for enduring well, for adapting quickly for being mature. But the body and the soul do not forget. They remember every place that was pressed, every part that was constricted. Jung believed that whatever is not lived according to one's true nature retreats into the unconscious, and from there exerts an indirect influence on life. He wrote, "Whatever is rejected from ourselves appears in the world as an event. When we do not listen to the pain within, it appears as fatigue, emptiness, or the feeling that life, however complete it may seem, still cannot bring peace." The image of stepping out of the shoes therefore carries a particular healing power. It does not demand that you change your entire life immediately. It simply invites you to pause, to bend down, and to feel. Do these shoes truly fit me? Jung did not advocate rejecting society or abandoning all responsibility. He advocated honesty with the individual process. Your path does not need to resemble anyone else's. And if it is causing you pain, that does not mean you are weak. It may simply mean that you have walked too long in a form that is not your own. The moment when bare feet touch the soft earth of the night is an archetypal moment. Soft earth symbolizes the maternal principle, unconditional support, the deep ground of the unconscious. When bare feet meet the ground, we no longer try to maintain a graceful gait, no longer need to step in the correct rhythm. We are allowed to feel our true weight again. Jung emphasized that psychological development is not about rising higher, but about going deeper. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Shoes that are too tight are part of that darkness, not to be condemned, but to be recognized. The sense of relief that comes with stepping out of the shoes is not an explosive joy. It is a lung-deep exhale, as if the body is finally permitted to release. Yet alongside that relief comes a deeply human fear. If we no longer wear those shoes, where will we go?" Jung did not soothe this fear with reassuring promises. He accepted it as an inevitable part of the process of individuation. "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," he wrote. "For when the old form is shed, the new path does not immediately appear. We stand there barefoot in the night, vulnerable yet real." The most persuasive power of this image lies in how it returns choice to the individual. No one can tell you which shoes you should wear. No theory can accurately measure the size of your soul. Jung believed that each person has a call, an inner summons, and suffering often arises when we walk against that call. Shoes that are too tight are not a mistake. They are a sign that it is time to listen more deeply. Thus, as we move from the theater mask to shoes that are too tight, the process is not broken. We have removed the mask from the face, and now we continue by shedding ways of living that no longer fit the rhythm of the inner step. The night is no longer a frightening void, but becomes soft ground supporting each slow step. In that silence, there is no applause, no evaluating gaze, only a human being learning how to walk again according to their true dimensions. And it is precisely here, in the sensation of bare feet touching the earth, that something important begins to happen. Energy is no longer forced upward, merely to endure. It begins to withdraw inward, preparing for an even deeper movement of the soul. The shoes have been set aside. The path ahead is unclear, but for the first time in a very long while, each step no longer hurts, and that in the Jungian spirit is already a profound form of healing. When the shoes that were too tight have been set aside, when your bare feet touch the soft earth of the night and are no longer forced to move according to an old shape, a subtle yet decisive shift begins to take place. It is no longer the pain of constriction and not yet complete peace. It is a redirection of the living current of energy. From that moment, we move seamlessly into the next chapter, slowing the libido. In Jungian language, libido is not merely sexual energy, as it is commonly understood. For Carl Jung, libido is the total psychic energy, the life force that animates thoughts, emotions, desires, and the movements of the soul. He wrote, "By libido, I mean psychic energy." Throughout the day, this energy is typically pushed outward, directed toward work, roles, responsibilities, the gaze of others, the noise of the world. This outward flow is necessary for survival. But when night comes, if that energy does not know how to return, a person becomes exhausted, even while the body lies still. After removing shoes that do not fit, the soul naturally wants to slow down, not out of laziness, but because it is seeking its original rhythm. The image of water leaving the noise of the streets to flow toward a deep underground spring is a delicate metaphor for this process. The noisy streets symbolize daytime consciousness, where everything moves quickly, clearly, with purpose. The deep underground spring symbolizes the unconscious, where movement is slow, dark, and rich with depth. Jung believed that psychological health depends on the ability to regulate this flow, not allowing it to remain endlessly directed outward. Many modern people feel exhausted, not because they lack energy, but because their energy is never permitted to rest. Even while sitting still, the mind continues to expend libido on anxiety comparison and self-surveillance. Jung observed this phenomenon early on, He wrote, "We are so captivated by and entangled in subjective consciousness that we have forgotten the age-old fact that God speaks chiefly through dreams and visions." When energy no longer turns inward, the deeper channels of the soul, dreams, intuition, inner images, gradually become starved. Slowing the libido is not an act of force. It is not a command to relax sleep or calm down. On the contrary, it is a permission. Permission for the current to slow, permission for libido to withdraw from the noisy surface and find its way back to the source. Jung believed that the nature of the soul always tends toward balance if we do not interfere. The psyche is a self-regulating system, he affirmed. When old forms of living are removed, when shoes no longer constrict the feet, energy will know on its own where to go. What is noteworthy is that this slowing is often accompanied by a frightening emptiness. When libido no longer pours outward, one may feel hollow, disoriented. Many people panic and rush to fill that void with new stimulation, screens, sounds, thoughts. But Jung viewed this emptiness as a threshold. He wrote, "In the process of individuation, the unconscious takes the lead. For the unconscious to speak, consciousness must step back. And that stepping back always creates a feeling of lost control. The image of the deep underground spring therefore carries a particular healing significance. The water there is not loud, not showy, yet it nourishes the entire ecosystem above. When libido flows back to the deep source, it does not disappear. It is regenerated. That is why a truly deep sleep, a genuine moment of stillness, can restore a person more than hours of half-rest. Jung once emphasized, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. And that heart cannot be heard amid noise." In the movement from shoes that are too tight to slowing the libido, there is a profoundly human transition from pain to quieting, from recognition to surrender. We no longer try to walk faster, nor do we try to prove that we are moving in the right direction. We simply allow energy to follow its natural trajectory. And that trajectory at night always turns inward. Jung did not see this withdrawal as regression. He saw it as a necessary stage of psychological maturation. The persuasive power of this concept lies in how it frees a person from the pressure to always be high energy. Not every moment requires forward motion. There are times when living truly means slowing down. Life calls not for perfection, but for completeness. Jung once said, "Wholeness is not achieved by operating at high speed at all times, but by the capacity to listen to one's deeper rhythm." and when libido has begun to flow back to the underground. Spring, something subtle occurs. The mind ceases its arguments. The body releases its tension. And silence is no longer frightening. It becomes a living space. In that space, sleep is no longer a forced shutdown, but a ritual of return. The life energy, after wandering all day through the streets, finally finds its way home. It is precisely here that we understand slowing down is not a loss of strength, but a transformation of strength, from outward directed power to power that nourishes the inner world, from noisy movement to a quiet current. And in the Jungian spirit, this is the moment when a human being draws closer to themselves, not through effort, but through trust in the deep wisdom of the soul. As the slowing of the life energy has taken place, as the current of libido is no longer stretched toward the outer world, but begins to withdraw deep into the inner, underground spring, a new state gradually opens. Not loud, not dramatic, yet profoundly transformative. It is the moment when movement settles to the point of near dissolution. From here, we enter sacred stillness, not as a leap, but as a gentle sinking to the bottom of the water where surface disturbances can no longer reach. For many people, silence is frightening. It feels like a void, an absence, a place the anxious mind rushes to fill with thoughts, memories, or unnamed fears. But Carl Jung viewed silence in an entirely different way. For him, silence is not the absence of life, but the necessary condition for deeper life to speak. He wrote, "Silence is a reservoir of energy." In the modern world, where every moment is occupied by sound information and reaction, human beings have lost the capacity to remain still, and with it, the capacity to encounter themselves. Sacred stillness is not a cold emptiness. It is a protected sanctuary where the most exhausted parts of the ego are allowed to dissolve without threat. When Jung spoke of the temporary dissolution of the ego, he did not mean destruction. He meant a necessary loosening. The ego is not master in its own house, Jung once observed. When the ego tries to control everything for too long, it becomes rigid, defensive, and exhausted. Stillness is the only place where the ego can lay down its weapons. What makes stillness sacred does not lie in its outward form, but in its psychological function. In silence, the temporary identities we carry, roles, achievements, images, begin to lose their grip, not because we reject them, but because they are no longer cowed by the energy of attention. Jung believed that many psychological crises do not arise from what we lack, but from what we cling to too tightly. When identity has grown tired, silence allows it to dissolve like salt in water, without pain, without force. Jung once wrote a simple yet weighty sentence: "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." Sacred stillness is precisely the condition that allows this gaze to turn inward. With the voice of the world no longer guiding us, inner images, dreams, memories, symbols begin to surface. And what is crucial is this: they appear only when we are not trying to find them. Silence does not force revelation. It merely creates the space for truth to step forward on its own. In the Jungian process, this is the moment of transition from effort to trust. When libido has slowed, when energy is no longer consumed by reaction, silence becomes a refuge. Many people fear that if they stop controlling, everything will collapse. But Jung observed the opposite. The psyche is a self-regulating system. When we stop interfering, the system finds its way back to balance. Stillness takes nothing away. It restores a deeper order. There is a great paradox here. Only in silence are we truly protected. The world teaches us to remain vigilant, to react constantly, to always be ready. Yet it is precisely this constant readiness that erodes the soul. Sacred stillness is like an invisible embrace, without demand, without judgment. It allows a person for a brief moment to not have to be anyone at all. Jung saw this as the condition under which individuation can unfold naturally, without coercion. In this state, the dissolution of a tired identity is not disorientation, but rest for the ego. Just as the body needs sleep to recover, the ego needs silence so that it does not become overly identified with its own image. Jung warned that when a person identifies completely with the ego, inner life becomes impoverished. The more one-sided his conscious attitude is, the more antagonistic and incompatible will the unconscious be. Stillness is the most natural way to break that one-sidedness, and it is precisely here that silence ceases to be a void that needs filling. It becomes a living space, an inner terrain where all parts of a person can coexist without competition. No explanation required. No improvement demanded. Simply presence. Jung believed that the deepest healing does not come from knowing more, but from experiencing the right rhythm. Silence allows that experience to occur, passing from slowing the libido into sacred stillness. The process unfolds like a deep breath. The breath does not strive, does not aim. It simply happens, and within that breath, the exhausted identity is allowed to dissolve, not to disappear, but to be restructured into a broader form. In the Jungian spirit, sacred stillness is not an endpoint. It is a threshold where the human being ceases to fear emptiness and begins to trust that beneath silence there is not nothingness, but a deep intelligence waiting to be heard. And from that stillness, the forgotten parts of the soul will gradually emerge, not with a call, but with a quiet, undeniable presence. As sacred stillness has opened like a safe refuge, when silence is no longer a frightening void, but becomes a protective embrace, another subtle movement begins to unfold. In that quiet, not everything dissolves. On the contrary, something begins to take shape. Not loudly, not demandingly, it appears like a faint reflection in the darkness. From that point of intersection, we move into the gentle, dark mirror, not through a shock of realization, but through a very soft recognition. Carl Jung never regarded darkness as something that must be eliminated. He saw it as an inevitable part of the whole human being. In stillness, when the ego has ceased defending itself, when social labels temporarily fall away, the darkness no longer carries the shape of a threat. It becomes a mirror, but not the cold mirror of judgment, rather a gentle mirror reflecting the parts that have been forgotten. Jung called this the shadow, and he wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality." The challenge here is not to defeat the ego, but to expand it. The dark mirror does not ask you to fix or improve anything. It simply invites you to look. And what you see is not necessarily ugly or dangerous. Very often, it is the parts that were once rejected for being too sensitive, too creative, too fragile, or too real for the world. The phrase, "holding the parts of you that were too beautiful for the world to handle," touches a painful truth. Not all rejected parts are rejected because they are bad. Many are pushed into the shadows because they do not fit the demands of their environment. Jung recognized this when he wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. What is forgotten does not disappear. It simply waits." The slowing of rhythm. Here is not a storytelling technique, but a psychological condition that allows this encounter to occur safely. The shadow cannot endure forceful intrusion. It does not appear when we rush to confront, process, or overcome it. It appears when we are quiet enough to no longer seek control. In the gentle, dark mirror, we are not facing an enemy, but an old companion, one who has carried for us emotions, desires, and capacities. That daytime consciousness, did not know where to place. Jung believed that the deepest healing does not come from light shining directly, but from the gentle integration of opposites. He wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one S being, but by integration of the opposites." The dark mirror is where this integration takes place, not through explanation, but through acknowledgement. When we see the shadow and do not turn away, something strange happens. Fear gradually dissolves, replaced by a sense of familiarity, as if we have encountered a part of ourselves that has been wandering for a very long time. The persuasive power of this image lies in how it reverses the common narrative about darkness. Instead of viewing it as the source of problems, Jung suggested that darkness is often where unlived potential is stored. He wrote, "In the unconscious, there are things so beautiful and so precious that our rational mind could never imagine them. The gentle dark mirror therefore reflects not only pain, but also the possibility of living more deeply, more truthfully, within the context of sleep and the liminal state. This encounter carries a particular healing quality. By day, the shadow often appears as exaggerated reactions, uncontrolled emotions, or recurring dreams. By night, under the protection of stillness, it can be present without causing rupture. Jung viewed dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, and it is precisely in the half-waking, half-sleeping state that the dark mirror becomes clearest. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul. He wrote, "What matters is this: the mirror does not demand that you change immediately. It only asks that you remain long enough to realize that these forgotten parts do not want to take control. They only want to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be invited back. When that happens, a deeply human feeling emerges, the quiet relief of reunion. Not excitement, but a softening of the inner world." As we move from sacred stillness into the gentle dark mirror, the process remains unbroken. Silence created the space, and the mirror appears within that very space. The exhausted ego does not vanish entirely. It begins to learn how to look back at itself through the reflection of the shadow. And in that gaze, judgment is gradually replaced by curiosity, and then by compassion. In the Jungian spirit, this is the moment when a person moves closer to wholeness, not by becoming better, but by becoming more complete. The gentle dark mirror does not promise absolute safety, but it offers something deeper, gentle honesty, and within that honesty, the parts that were once too beautiful for the world to accept finally find refuge, not anywhere else, but within you yourself. The gentle, dark mirror has reflected the forgotten parts of us with tenderness. When darkness is no longer a place to turn away from, but becomes a surface we can look into, a deeper movement begins to unfold. Reflection alone is not enough. Seeing alone is still not complete. For within that darkness, there is not only an image, there is a presence. From there, we move seamlessly into the next chapter. The Disowned Brother. The image of a brother touches a profoundly human layer of Jungian psychology. The shadow is not a foreign or evil entity, but kin to consciousness, born from the same source, raised in the same inner house, yet pushed down into the basement because it did not fit the light of the living room. Jung wrote bluntly, "The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part, inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors." What matters here is not the word inferior, but the word repressed. The shadow is not distorted by nature. It becomes distorted because it is abandoned. Disowned, rejected, is the central word here. The brother in the basement did not choose to live in the dark. He was pushed there by very early survival choices to be more obedient, stronger, more rational, more acceptable. Each time we say, "This part of me is not allowed to exist," we push a fragment of ourselves further down. Jung recognized that the cost of excessive social adaptation is inner fragmentation. He wrote, "The repression of painful memories and emotions leads to the creation of a shadow that lives its own life. And that separate life does not disappear. It waits. This brother does not stand outside to sabotage. He knocks on the door, not with logic, but with emotion, with intense reactions, with recurring dreams, with moments when we ask ourselves, "Why did I act like that?" Jung emphasized, the shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. Refusal does not weaken the shadow. It makes the shadow hungry. And what is hungry will seek to be seen. The image of asking for a seat at the table of your heart carries deep moral force. The shadow does not ask for control. It does not demand to replace the ego. It asks only for a seat, an acknowledgement that it too belongs to the inner family. Jung never romanticized the shadow. He did not claim that everything disowned is good. But he insisted that there is no path to wholeness that bypasses the shadow. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To make darkness conscious does not mean acting it out, but entering into dialogue with it. That dialogue can take place only in dim light. The harsh light of moral judgment causes the shadow to retreat or strike back. Only in the gentle light of compassion does the brother in the basement dare to climb the stairs. Jung understood that mature morality is not about choosing light and eliminating darkness, but about taking responsibility for the whole of oneself. He wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." Acceptance here does not mean endorsing every impulse, but acknowledging their existence. The disowned brother often carries old wounds, not only anger or envy, but also sorrow, sensitivity, and the capacity to love deeply, qualities that once made us vulnerable and were therefore hidden away. For this reason, the shadow often has two faces, frightening and pitiable at the same time. Jung noted that the shadow also contains seeds of creativity. In the unconscious, there are things so beautiful and so precious that our rational mind could never imagine them. When the brother is invited to the table, not everything becomes comfortable, but inner life begins to breathe again. In this process, the hardest part is not seeing the shadow, but stopping the habit of treating it as an enemy. Enemies must be defeated. Brothers must be listened to even without agreement. Jung believed that when the shadow is excluded, it finds its way back in more distorted forms. But when it is acknowledged, it loses the need to sabotage. The shadow becomes hostile only when it is ignored or misunderstood, he wrote. Hostility is the consequence of prolonged silence, not the original nature. The continuity from the gentle dark mirror to the disowned brother lies here we have seen, and now we invite. The mirror reflected. The table is where dialogue happens. This is the shift from awareness to relationship. No longer I see the darkness, but I speak with it. In the context of sleep and the liminal state, this dialogue does not occur through words, but through felt safety. When the body relaxes, when the ego is no longer defensive, the shadow no longer needs to shout. The persuasive power of the brother image lies in its restoration of humanity to darkness. Rather than seeing it as a set of impulses to be controlled, Jung invites us to see it as a member of the inner family who has endured too much isolation. And families are not healed through discipline, but through sustained presence. When the brother has a seat, something profound happens. The ego no longer has to spend energy guarding the basement. Tension decreases. The entire psychological system becomes less fragmented. This is not a moment of victory, but a moment of reconciliation. Jung saw this reconciliation as the foundation of individuation, the path of becoming oneself in a complete way. And in that spirit, the disowned brother is no longer a dark image. He becomes the keeper of memory, the bearer of messages, the one who reminds us that no part of a human being needs to remain in exile forever. When we find the courage to invite him to the table, in dim yet warm light, we do not merely heal an abandoned part, we restore our own wholeness. The disowned brother has been invited to the table. When the shadow no longer stands outside as an exile, but is acknowledged as a member of the inner family, something very subtle, yet decisive, occurs. The urge to do something begins to subside. There is no longer an immediate need to fix, justify, or restructure oneself. From this fragile state of reconciliation, we move naturally and seamlessly into the next chapter, staying with the pulse. This is one of the most difficult moments for modern human beings. We are trained to act, to optimize, to improve. When a part of us is discovered, especially the shadow, the first reflex is often, "So what should I do with it?" But Jung moved in the opposite direction. He did not rush to offer solutions. He invited staying. He wrote, "The most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble, not because we are inadequate, but because there are psychological processes that cannot be forced forward by willpower. Staying with the pulse is not passivity, nor is it resignation. It is a deeper form of courage. The courage not to intervene. When there is no one left to impress, nothing left to fix, a person is allowed for the first time to listen to their own natural rhythm. The rhythm of the breath, the rhythm of the heart, the rising and falling of emotion." Jung believed that it is precisely in this listening that inner order begins to reorganize itself. The psyche is a self-regulating system, he affirmed, but only when we stop constantly disrupting it through excessive control. The sentence, "There is nothing to fix and no one to impress," strikes at a collective exhaustion. Many people live as if there is always an invisible gaze watching them, even when they are completely alone. The persona may have been removed. The shadow may have been invited to the table, yet the habit of self-surveillance remains. Staying with the pulse is an invitation to interrupt this surveillance loop. No one is grading you. There is no audience. There is only a body breathing and a soul slowly finding its bearings. Jung understood that when inner opposites are placed side by side, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, an inevitable tension arises. He called this the tension of the opposites, And the ego, as natural reflex, is to resolve that tension as quickly as possible. But Jung believed that it is precisely the capacity to endure tension without rushing to resolve it that allows a third thing to emerge, a new form of inner organization. He wrote, "Out of the tension of opposites, a third thing emerges. The pulse is where we remain with that tension without breaking it. Staying does not mean analyzing. It does not mean thinking more." Jung repeatedly warned against over-intellectualizing living processes. Intellect has nothing to do with it, for it only destroys the symbol, he wrote. The pulse is not a concept. It is a bodily experience. When we follow the breath, not to achieve any state, but simply to be there, something strange happens. Thought naturally slows down, not because we force it, but because the energy that feeds it is no longer supplied. The reorientation of the inner world happens very quietly. There is no moment of illumination, no declaration of victory. Jung referred to these changes as transformation in silence. They can occur only when we are not standing guard. Nature must not win the game, but she cannot lose it, he once said. The pulse is the place where the nature of the soul is allowed to operate according to its own laws, free from interference by the impatient ego. What makes staying with the pulse so powerfully healing is that it returns agency to the process, not to the ego. The ego is accustomed to controlling, but not to trusting. When we stay with the breath, we are practicing a very concrete form of trust, trusting that not everything needs our intervention in order to be okay. Jung believed that many psychological disturbances do not arise from instinctual forces, but from mistimed interference by consciousness. Within the context of sleep and the liminal state, staying with the pulse is especially important. Before sleep, the ego naturally weakens. If we try to do something, try to sleep, try to relax, try to let go, we inadvertently reactivate control. But if we simply follow the breath without purpose, without expectation, sleep can find us on its own. Jung viewed sleep as a necessary surrender of the ego, and surrender occurs only when effort ceases. The continuity from the disowned brother to staying with the pulse lies here after reconciliation. What is needed is not action, but time. Time for the inner parts to become accustomed to one another's presence. Time for the body to recalibrate its rhythm. No deep process unfolds in haste. Jung emphasized the individuation process is a natural unfolding, and what is natural cannot be rushed. And it is precisely in this staying that something deeply human appears. The sense that one does not need to become someone else in order to exist. The pulse demands no achievement. The breath requires no explanation. They ask only to be allowed to happen. In that moment, the ego does not disappear, but it stops dominating. It becomes part of the whole rather than the commander. Staying with the pulsa, in the end, is not a relaxation technique. It is a temporary attitude toward life, an attitude that allows the inner world to reorganize itself when given quiet. And in the Jungian spirit, this is the foundation of all deep transformation, not through effort, but through sustained presence. When we stay without fixing, without performing, without impressing, the inner world begins to find its own direction, again slowly, deeply, and in its own true rhythm. After staying with the pulse long enough, when we are no longer rushing to fix or impress, something profound happens. Without announcement, the will to control begins to grow weary. Not because we have failed, but because we have remained still long enough to realize that we no longer need to strain ourselves. From that very thin moment of transition, we move into dropping the pack, like setting down a backpack we have carried our entire lives without ever knowing we were allowed to take it off. Dropping the pack is not abandoning responsibility, nor is it indifference to life. It is the act of setting down the weight of having to be okay, an invisible burden. Modern people have grown accustomed to carrying on their shoulders. We learn to reassure others, to reassure ourselves, to maintain an image of balance, no matter what is happening inside. Yet in the Jungian spirit, it is precisely the effort to maintain that image that drains our energy. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." This insight extends into adult life. The greatest burden we often carry is our own unlived life, compressed beneath the demand to always be fine. The image of gently placing the backpack on the floor is healing because it is non-violent. No throwing away, no tearing apart, just setting it down softly, consciously. Releasing control in Jung is never a blind leap. It is the outcome of a ripened process. We have seen the shadow, stayed with, the breath endured the tension of opposites without intervening. Now letting go is no longer frightening because we have tasted a simple truth. Things continue to function even when we are not straining. The universe will spin without your effort now. This sentence touches the ego's deepest fear. If I do not control things, everything will collapse. Jung regarded this fear as a necessary illusion in the early stages of life, but a chain once we mature. He affirmed, the psyche is a self-regulating system, when the ego intervenes, less a deeper order is allowed to emerge. Not the order of planning, but the order of meaning. Letting go of control is also letting go of constant self-surveillance. Many people cannot sleep, not because they lack relaxation, but because they are monitoring themselves, checking whether they are calm enough, good enough, correct enough. Jung saw this self-monitoring as a continuation of the persona into the night. When the backpack is set down, we stop playing the role of manager of our own lives. And the strange truth is this life does not require a constant manager. In the process of individuation, Jung placed special emphasis on conscious surrender. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." The choice here is not to control more, but to choose trust in the natural process of the soul. Letting go does not make us smaller. It makes us spacious enough to contain what is happening without force. The persuasive power of dropping the pack lies in how it frees human beings from the obligation to be strong at all times. There are moments when the greatest strength is the courage to set things down, to dare to admit that we do not need to strain ourselves for the world to keep turning. Jung once noted, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. When we release, thought stops commanding, and feeling stops resisting. A quiet harmony begins to form. The continuity from staying with the pulse to dropping the pack lies here. We have stayed long enough to see that not acting is also an action. Staying with the breath exhausts the habit of interference. Letting go is the natural consequence of that exhaustion. No grand decision is required, just setting it down. And when the backpack touches the floor, the body responds before the mind does. Shoulders drop, the jaw softens, the breath deepens. In the context of sleep, releasing control is the final doorway. We do not enter sleep through effort. Sleep receives us when we stop holding on. Jung viewed sleep as a primordial rebalancing of the soul, a time when the ego temporarily withdraws so the unconscious can do its work. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul, he wrote, but only when the ego consents to be silent. Letting go of control is not the end of the journey. It is a turning point. From here, inner life no longer revolves around the question, "What must I do?" but around presence. What is wanting to happen? When the backpack has been set down, empty hands are not for neglect, but for receiving. And in the Jungian spirit, it is precisely in that moment when we stop proving that we are okay. Stop directing the spin of the universe that a human being comes closest to. Deep trust. Trusting that life has its own intelligence, and that this intelligence does not require our tension in order to keep moving. Letting go of control has now been completed in full. When the backpack of always having to be okay is gently set down on the floor, and the hands no longer grip anything, another movement begins, no longer led by will. There is no decision, no plan. There is only the sensation of being held. From that state of conscious surrender, we step into the return journey, like a leaf drifting on a moonlit river, allowing the current to carry us back to a place that is very far and yet very near. The image of drifting is crucial. It stands in complete contrast to the aggressive, uphill, conquering mode of life, so familiar to modern humanity. Jung understood that there are phases of the soul's life that cannot move forward through effort, but can only return through permission. He called this movement a return to the source of meaning, where the soul once learned the name of itself. In Symbols of Transformation, Jung wrote of the need to return to the primordial images of the unconscious. The way of the soul is not straight. It is a spiral. The return journey does not deny the path already taken. It spirals back, carrying experience with it to touch the roots. The moonlit river is a profound metaphor for the unconscious, not noisy like the daytime, not exposed like the sun, but reflecting light indirectly gentle, deep, and sufficient to see by. When we drift upon that river, the ego is no longer the boatman. It becomes a passenger. And it is precisely in that humble role that the soul begins to remember what was forgotten. Identity is not something constructed, but something recovered. Jung often emphasized that the modern crisis arises from a rupture with inner origins. He wrote, "Man has lost his roots and cannot live without them." The return journey is a wordless answer to that loss of roots. We do not return out of nostalgia, nor to deny the present, but to reconnect the thread of meaning that once guided inner life. At that deep source, the soul learns its name not through social language, but through a sense of belonging. What makes this journey safe is its slow rhythm. There is no coercion of memory, no excavation. Jung warned that a crude invasion of the unconscious can be harmful. He wrote, "The unconscious can make a fool of you in no time." Therefore, the image of the drifting leaf is a reminder of the right attitude. Trust the current. Do not argue with it. When we drift, the unconscious guides by symbol, by sensation, by small fragments of memory and reverie, enough to orient us, not so much as to overwhelm. The return journey is also a reversal of energy from outer directed to inner-directed, from what must I do to what is calling me. Jung believed that each person carries an ancient call within, not a rigid fate, but a deep inclination of the soul. He wrote, "There is a destiny which makes itself known by intimations. These intimations, the faintest hints, can only be heard when we are quiet enough to drift." The persuasive power of the return journey lies in how it frees us from the illusion that we must recreate ourselves from zero. There is no need to reinvent one's life, no need for a new identity. Only a return to the point where meaning arises, where values have not yet been worn down by comparison and expectation. There, we do not need to prove anything. We only need to recognize. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." The awakening here is not loud. It is as quiet as water flowing upstream in the night. The continuity from letting go of control to the return journey lies here once the burden has been set down. The gravity of the deep source begins to draw us back, not by force, but by attraction. We do not decide to return. We are called. And after drifting long enough, sharp questions soften, giving way to a sense of familiarity, as if we have been here before, long before we learned how to run. Within the context of sleep and the liminal state, this journey completes an arc from effort to surrender, from control to trust, from role to source. Jung viewed dreams as the natural bridge of the return journey, where symbols lead us into the deep past, not to trap us there, but to reposition present meaning. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul, he wrote, and the moonlit river is precisely the path of those guiding words. Ultimately, returning to where the soul learned its name does not mean withdrawing from life. It means carrying the source with us when we return. The return journey prepares us for a different re-emergence, lighter, truer, and less afraid. When the leaf has drifted through that stretch of river, it does not disappear. It changes direction, carrying the memory of the deep source to continue living without forgetting who it is. And in the Jungian spirit, this is the turning point of the entire journey, not to remain forever in the night, but to step into daylight with roots reconnected. When we know where we learned our name, we no longer need to shout to be called. We only need to drift with the right current and allow the moonlight to lead the way. The upstream journey has carried us back to the deep source where the soul once learned its own name, and something quiet yet decisive begins to happen. There is no longer movement, no longer searching. The moonlit river slows, the leaf ceases to drift, and at the heart of this return, an ancient image appears as if it had always been there, waiting to be seen. The Sacred Mandala. The mandala is not a symbol to be understood by the intellect. For Carl Jung, the mandala is the natural language of the soul as it approaches a state of wholeness. Through many years of studying patience and his own inner experience, Jung recognized that when human beings pass through profound crises, the unconscious often spontaneously produces circular images with a center balanced ordered forms. He wrote, "The mandala is the psychological expression of the totality of the self. The mandala is not created for decoration. It emerges when the soul needs to reorganize itself. The continuity between the upstream journey and the mandala lies here. After returning to the source, the soul no longer wanders. It finds a center. Returning is not about remaining in the past, but about allowing a new form of organization to arise. The mandala is the natural outcome of that return, an image showing that fragments, once separated for survival, can now be woven back into a living circle. Focus on the center is not a call for tense concentration. It is an invitation to recognize that a center has always been present, even when we were unaware of it. Jung called this center the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the deepest organizing principle of the psyche. He wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious." The mandala does not eliminate contradictions. It holds them within a larger order. What makes the mandala sacred is not its mystical form, but its healing function. When the broken pieces of life, conflicting emotions, fragmented memories, rejected longings are seen from the center, they no longer compete for position. They find their place. Jung observed that many psychological symptoms arise not from specific content, but from inner disorder. The mandala appears as a self-regulating response, helping the soul restore balance without commands from consciousness. The image of being woven back into a single radiant circle of peace carries particular persuasive power because it does not promise perfection. The radiant circle is not made of unbroken pieces, but of fragments that were once shattered. Jung emphasized that wholeness does not mean the absence of wounds. He wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one being, but by integration of the opposites." The mandala is where opposites, light and dark, strength and vulnerability, control and surrender, coexist without annihilating one another. The subtle movement of the mandala in the visual image reflects an important Jungian truth. The self is not a fixed state. It is a living process. The mandala turns not to carry us elsewhere, but to remind us that the center remains present within movement itself. When we grow weary from trying to maintain balance, the mandala reveals that balance is not stillness, but rotation around a stable center. Jung observed that when people encounter mandala images in dreams or active imagination, they often experience a deep peace, not excitement, not climax, but a sense of abiding. He wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. This defeat is not loss, but the relinquishment of dominance. The ego no longer needs to stand at the center, directing everything. It finds its proper place within the whole." This explains why the mandala appears after the journey of letting go and returning. If the ego is still straining to control, the mandala remains an empty image. But when the backpack has been set down, when the river has carried us back to the source, the soul is safe enough to reveal its structure. Jung believed that the unconscious offers powerful symbols only when consciousness is humble enough to receive them. Within the context of sleep and the liminal state, the mandala functions like an anchor. It does not keep us awake. It allows us to sleep deeply. When the soul recognizes that there is a center spacious enough to hold every fragment, anxiety no longer needs to persist. Jung viewed sleep as the phase in which the unconscious performs its integrative work. The mandala is a sign that this process is unfolding harmoniously. Dreams are the compensatory function of the unconscious, he wrote, and the mandala is among the healthiest forms of such compensation. The persuasive power of the sacred mandala lies in the fact that it does not ask you to become someone else. It sets no goal. It simply invites you to remain with the center long enough to feel stability spread. There is no need to repair the past, no need to defend the future. The fragments find their way home when they are not forced. The continuity from the upstream journey to the mandala of wholeness is therefore not a leap, but a settling. Returning to the source prepares the ground for discovering the center. And when the center appears, the journey ceases to be a journey. It becomes a place. In the Jungian spirit, the mandala is not a final destination, but evidence that an inner order is being restored. From here, a person can step back into daytime life without losing themselves, not because all conflicts have been resolved, but because a center firm enough to revolve around has been found. And in the gentle light of that circle, the fragments of life that were once scattered no longer cry out. They are woven together, not into a perfect story, but into a living form filled with meaning. That is the peace of the mandala. Not silence, because nothing remains, but silence, because everything has found its place. The mandala of wholeness has gradually stabilized at the inner center. As the fragments no longer compete, but find their places around a steady core, a beautiful paradox emerges. Nothing more needs to be done. In this quiet completion, the journey does not end through effort, but opens through rest. From the heart of the mandala, we move seamlessly into the final chapter. Awakening in repose, where wakefulness does not oppose sleep, and truth does not need to be pursued. Carl Jung spoke these words not as a slogan, but as a psychological law. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This sentence is often misunderstood as a call to do something. But in the deepest Jungian sense, making the unconscious conscious does not mean illuminating it with the headlights of reason. It means creating the conditions for the unconscious to reveal itself through dreams, symbols, sensations, and subtle movements that appear only when the ego agrees to step back. That is repose, active rest, a settling of the will. The continuity between the mandala and awakening in repose lies here when inner order has been restored. Wakefulness no longer requires tension. The mandala shows that there is a center spacious enough to contain both consciousness and the unconscious. Awakening in sleep is the moment we trust that center enough to dissolve into rest. Jung wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. This defeat here is a gentle surrender. The ego no longer needs to stand guard. It is allowed to sleep. As you vanish into sleep, you dissolve into sleep, not as disappearance, but as return." This is the reversal at the heart of Jungian language. Sleep is no longer a shutdown, but a transfer of authority. When the ego withdraws, the unconscious, with its ancient intelligence, begins its work of integration. Jung regarded dreams as the soul as native language. He wrote, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul. Only when we sleep deeply do those guiding words have space to speak, not to shock us awake, but to orient us quietly." The phrase "coming home to the truth of who you are" does not promise a radiant new ego. It promises familiarity. Coming home means returning to a place where nothing needs to be proven. In the Jungian process, truth is not a proposition of right or wrong, but a deep congruence between outer life and inner structure. When the unconscious has been invited to the table, when opposites have been integrated within the mandala, sleep becomes a ritual of coming home, a place where you are allowed to be yourself without having to name yourself. What makes awakening in repose convincing is its paradox. Awakening happens when we stop trying to awaken. Jung repeatedly warned against over-intellectualizing the inner path. Intellect has nothing to do with it, for it only destroys the symbol he wrote. Awakening here is not an accumulation of insight, but a stillness, deep enough for symbols to do their work. Deep sleep does not oppose awareness. It is the condition that allows deeper awareness to emerge without harm. At this point, fate changes meaning. When the unconscious is listened to, events that once seemed random or cruel begin to align like purposeful fragments. Jung did not deny fate. He redefined it. Fate is not an external hand, but the trajectory of unlived parts of the self. When those parts are lived, even if only through recognition, the trajectory shifts. And that shift often occurs in the silence of sleep, without announcement. Here, awakening does not pull you out of sleep. It moves with sleep. This wakefulness is like a soft light behind a curtain, not glaring, not disruptive, but enough to know that meaning is present. Jung wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. In repose, that conflict subsides. Feeling no longer resists thought. Thought no longer dominates feeling. Both rest within a larger order." The continuity from the mandala of wholeness to awakening in repose is therefore not a final step, but the stabilization of the entire process. The mandala reveals the center. Sleep allows the center to operate. No further technique is needed. No further instruction. Only staying long enough to trust that the psyche as self-regulating system knows what it is doing. Jung affirmed, "The psyche is a self-regulating system. Awakening in repose is the moment we stop obstructing that regulation." Within the context of a sleep story, this ending does not close, it opens. It opens for the night to work on our behalf. It opens for the unconscious to continue integrating. It opens for morning to arrive more gently. Not because every problem has disappeared, but because we have found a way to be with them without being carried away. This is a quiet awakening, one that requires no audience. And as you dissolve into sleep, if any truth is brought home with you, let it be this simple one: you do not need to strain to become yourself. When the unconscious is respected, life is no longer driven like fate. It becomes a collaboration between light and shadow, between birth, day and night, between waking and sleeping. In that collaboration, you do not disappear, you return. Night does not come to swallow you. Night comes to hold what you no longer need to carry. All roles have been set down. All fragments have found their place. There is nothing left to fix. No one left to impress. Here in this stillness, the world continues to move without your tension. Breath continues. The current flows. And your true self, without mask, without burden, is allowed to rest. If anything remains, let it drift into sleep with you. No need to understand. No need to hold on. Just be there. The world is safe in the hands of the night, and you are allowed to rest in your own light now.